Well, welcome everyone. We are very excited that you have been able to join us for our post-election briefing. My name is Alex Worth, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Quorum. I'm exceptionally excited to be joined by a large team of Holland and Knight professionals today as we give you an overview on what we know so far with the election, what are some possible outcomes, as well as talking about what that means for all of you. So over the next 2.5 hours, we've got a really rich program. It's going to start at the top with an overview from the H&K team about what we know, diving into the election results to give a good summary of the current state of House, Senate, congressional, presidential, and state legislative races. We then got the legal team from Holland and Knight focused on determining unknown outcomes and potential legal challenges to dive into some of the uncertainty that we are currently have waiting for the election results. We'll then share some information that the Quorum teams put together around the demographics of the 117th Congress to give you some insight on some of those demographics that might not have covered and made the top of the headlines, but have a lot of specific relation to your lobbying and advocacy strategies. And then we'll go back to a different group of Holland and Knight team to talk about what the new Congress and administration is going to mean and the impact that that's going to have on specific policy issues. Getting into some of the dynamics about what might play out during the transition in the first 100 days. And finally, we're going to take all of this information, and Rich and I are going to summarize some series of strategies and best practices at the end, with the goal being that you don't leave this webinar stressed and worried, but instead have some very concrete action items that you can take back to your organizations and implement as we all prepare for a new Congress and possibly a new administration. With that, I'm excited to turn it over to Rich Gold to introduce himself and the Holland and Knight team, as well as our first panel. Rich, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Alex, and thanks everybody for joining today. We're happy to have you with us. Just to do a couple added cleanup notes in terms of how we're going to run things. As Alex mentioned, we're going to have a series of several panels. The panels themselves, each panel will probably be 15 to 20 minutes of us talking and giving you background, followed by Q&A from you all for that panel within that panel. So if as we're speaking, you have questions, as was referenced by Satya, please use your Q&A. I will pull the questions from there and play MC and ask the right person on the panel that question, and we can kind of go from there. Don't worry if you missed the opportunity to ask a question. I can certainly go back later on to a previous panel and follow up on that. We'll all be here for the full time we're going through. With that, let me thank everybody for coming. Obviously, Tuesday night, Wednesday, and now Thursday have been big days. It's no longer election day, it's election fortnight, as I've been calling it, and hopefully we won't go on that long, but and we'll get some results here before that, but it's obviously not the traditional Tuesday night everybody goes to sleep having a sense of where things are going. But things are moving, and that's what our first panel is going to do, is kind of go through where things stand with the presidency, with Congress, the governors, the attorneys general, and state legislatures, and let you guys ask questions about that stuff. So our first panel consists of 4 of my colleagues, Beth Viola, who was a senior advisor to Vice President Gore for 8 years in the Clinton administration. She, among other things, was the keeper of the slides in terms of an inconvenient truth, but a senior advisor to him on climate change and related energy and environmental issues. So we are welcome Beth this morning. Catherine Lehman, who is one of our senior House Republican lobbyists and held many positions in the early 2000s and 1990s with House Republican leadership. Jim Schultz, who runs our Pennsylvania and Northeast lobbying and policy operation for Holland and Knight, was most recently, prior to coming out of government, the Associate White House Counsel for President Trump in the White House. And we'll start off with that panel. I think Beth's going to start out doing details on where things stand on the presidency. So let me kick it over to you, Beth.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for having me and really appreciate everyone taking the time to join us. As you can see, we're just getting ready to put up a couple of slides here. As Rich mentioned, this is now election week, and so like everyone else in the country, I am also anxiously awaiting to see how this election is going to turn out. At least in terms of the presidency, we still are very much in a counting mode here. As we can see on this map, President Trump has 214 electoral votes at this moment, and Vice President Biden has 264 electoral votes. The counting is very much continuing in a couple of key states. I'm going to start with the South and start with Georgia and say that the race there has tightened quite a bit. And we've got Vice President Biden with a slight lead there. We're going to expect to see those numbers continue. North Carolina, those numbers are very much look like they're going to be those electoral votes will go to President Trump. Nevada is continuing. We may not see the numbers completely in from Nevada until tomorrow, but Pennsylvania is the big game changer, and that's the one where we're seeing the most attention, and where until just right before we started this, Vice President Biden was up almost 9,000 votes this morning. So we anticipate that we are likely to see some kind of calling of the race this afternoon in terms of Pennsylvania, and the other states will continue to get counted. Catherine, should I turn over to you to talk about the House? But you're on mute.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Friday, I guess. It's been an exciting week. I just wanted to go over the numbers a little bit for the House. I have to say they're very fluid. As you know, the House was at 232 Democrats, 197 Republicans, 1 Libertarian, and 5 vacancies. And depending on who you talk to, I should say which websites you look at, it's somewhere around, Real Clear Politics has 208 Democrat, 193 Republican, which would be 34 outstanding. The numbers I got from the NRCC this morning has 27 outstanding, which is 17 Democrat and 10 Republican. Of those 27, 5 are open, 1 is a Democratic seat, and 4 is a Republican seat. I'm just going to do a little sort of back of the envelope map. If Democrats hold all their opens, they would be at 225, and Republicans would be at 203. I think it's more likely that the Democrats end up in the low 220s, Republicans in the mid-teens, around 215. I think the story of this election on the House Republican part of the world, or just the House generally, is there was expected to be a blue wave. The polls in individual districts, from what I'm reading, were far less, far less accurate than the presidential. And we're not talking margin of error inaccurate, we're talking wildly inaccurate, which meant that Republicans were putting money into saving incumbents, and Democrats were putting money into expanding their field, which is going after Republican incumbents. But that's not what happened. One example, the D-Trip had to pump money into Sherry Boost's seat in Illinois. She was challenged by Esther Joy King, and she's the chairman of the D-Trip. So anytime you have to spend money to save the chairman of your party committee, that shows you're not on the playing field you thought you were on. I just want to point out a few seats that Republicans were very worried about. We're worried about Indiana 5 holding Susan Brooks's seat. Victoria Spartz beat Christina Hale by almost 20,000 votes. John Katko's seat, New York, great guy, moderate, always a swing district. He won by 55,000 votes, although that one has not been called yet because it's New York. Missouri 2, Ann Wagner, suburban district in Missouri, she won by 30,000 votes. And I think one of the other surprises was the Will Hurd seat. You know, Will Hurd, again, a moderate, bit of a challenge being a Republican moderate in Texas in with the Trump presidency. And his replacement, we thought we were going to lose that seat. His replacement won by 12,000 votes. A couple other quick notes. Democrats did flip 2 seats, both in North Carolina. I think most people would agree that was due to redistricting. Republicans have for sure picked up 8 seats so far. 7 of the 8 are women. I'm very proud to say I'm on the board of BUPAC, which is the group that tries to get more Republicans into Congress, and we've had a great year. One in particular I want to point out, well, 2. One, Republicans have been running against Colin Peterson since the dawn of time, and we finally flipped that seat. And then in Florida, we won the 2, I guess, Hispanic seats. Maria Elvira Salazar, that's the old Ross Layton seat, beat Donna Shalala. And of the outstanding ones, there are still some where there's quite a few, maybe little less than half, that Republican could still win. So what does it mean? Again, polls are wrong, not margin of error wrong, really wrong. I want to say, in terms of where the Democrats are now and the Republicans are now, it reminds me of 1998 when I was working for Speaker Gingrich. We were expected to pick up seats because that is a historical trend when you have a party opposing president in power. We didn't. We were down to a 6-seat margin. Lots of anger, lots of soul searching. Newt did not hold on, as you will recall. I do believe that Pelosi will hang on. I think there will be some soul searching, some policy soul searching. It will be, I think Spanberger was quoted yesterday at the Democratic caucus meeting saying, stop talking about socialism. It's not helping us. And then we need to see at some point analysis of presidential numbers in the districts where Republicans were not expected to win and did win, because I'm curious to see. My guess is they outperformed the president, especially in some of those New York seats. And so that's just something to look at as we dig further into the numbers. That's it.
Thanks very much, Catherine. We're going to go back to Beth for the Senate, I think.
Correct. So I think there is a lot of thought before this election, at least on behalf of Democrats in this country, that there may be a big blue wave and a complete clean sweep, and that the Democrats would control the White House, potentially control the White House, this House, and the Senate. Currently, the Senate, we're at 48-48, and we have 4 uncalled races. Those races are all going to be really important to what the potential makeup of the Senate looks like and who maintains the majority or controls the majority. But regardless, we're going to have a very, very tight margins, regardless who leads. In the outstanding races that we have right now, Tom Tillis in North Carolina, and that race against Cal Cunningham, and he has a slight lead there. And I think all signs indicate that he's probably going to take that seat. In Georgia, that is, as we talked about, there's still an awful lot of counting going on, but at this point, it appears that neither of the Senate candidates, you have 2 Senate races there. One is Kelly Loeffler's seat, and the other is Senator Perdue up for re-election. And at this point, it doesn't appear that either candidate is going to get above 50%. And based on their rules there, that would require them to have another election in January. So they will not know what the outcome is until January 5th in that race. So that will be interesting. And as one of our colleagues said this morning, it would be a great time to own a television station in Georgia. The other outstanding race is Alaska. And right now, incumbent Dan Sullivan has a pretty significant lead over his opponent, Dr. Al Gross. I will say, though, Alaska is a very odd place, and it's going to take quite a bit of time to count those votes. And I don't know any other candidate who's worked harder to raise money and to try to build support and get votes than Dr. Gross. And he made many, many personal phone calls and was able to raise a significant amount of money. So while I anticipate that Senator Sullivan keeps that seat, I do think it's going to be one to watch, and it could be a sleeper surprise. you know, overall, the Democrats did pick up 2 new seats that are of interest. Hickenlooper defeated Cory Gardner in Colorado, and Mark Kelly has just finally been called for Arizona, and he defeated Martha McSally. That is former Senator McCain's seat, and Martha McSally had been appointed to that seat after his death. Other races really quickly of note, Michigan, Senator Gary Peters managed to hang on, which I think the Democrats were thrilled about. The Republicans also had a couple of good pickups. Obviously, Tommy Tuberville defeated Senator Collins. Having a moment, defeated, he won that race there. And then Senator Collins in Maine managed to defeat Sarah Gideon and hold on to her seat. However, that was a surprise. I think the Democrats did put a significant amount of money into trying to defeat Senator Collins, and she won fairly significantly. And yes, I do know it's Doug Jones. So I apologize. I was getting my Dougs and my Collins confused. And then, of course, the other one where there was a significant amount of money that was put in there into the race was in South Carolina. And Lindsey Graham did manage to win that race and has commented that for everyone, every Democrat across the country who put money into that race, it was a very significant waste of money. So I think we'll just have to continue to hold on and see what happens in these 4 outstanding races.
Thanks, Beth. We want to go down to the states at this point and do the governors, the state legislatures, and state AGs quickly, and then we're going to go ahead and open it up to questions. So let me kick it over to Catherine and Jim Schultz to do governors and legislatures and AGs.
I'm going to defer to Jim. This is his world.
All right, Jim, go ahead.
All right, great. So we had with all the 11 gubernatorial races called, the Republicans held all 11 of the seats that they had up. They flipped Montana. They flipped Missouri. Missouri had an incumbent, had an appointee in there, and that appointee was reelected. It was elected, and the first time in Missouri's history, I think out of 20 out of 28 years, it's been a Democratic governor. So Republicans had a great year. We kept talking about hearing about the blue wave as it relates to gubernatorial races. When it comes to AG races, we're still waiting on Stein and Shapiro. Stein is in North Carolina. Shapiro is in Pennsylvania. Those are going to be solidly in the camp of Stein and Shapiro. We think they're both going to win as they continue to count votes. Shapiro, I believe, is going to be the largest vote getter in the history of Pennsylvania elections in that AG race, and he's a likely hopeful for to replace Tom Wolf as governor down the road. Going forward to state legislatures, I mean, the Democrats again thought there was going to be a blue wave cutting across the states, put $500 million into state legislative races in places like Texas, Iowa, and Pennsylvania, and failed at every turn in terms of flipping those state legislatures. And in many cases, like in Pennsylvania, seats were picked up in the Senate and the House. And it looks like some of the row offices, even in states like Pennsylvania, are going from blue to red. So it's very, it's a very interesting dynamic, and why it's important on the state legislative side is because we're going into redistricting, and with the census results coming in, state legislatures across the country typically, in most cases, draw the lines for the legislative offices going forward.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate it. So let me wrap it a little bit with a couple of comments, and one administratively. The Holland slides are being loaded with the latest deck that we just finished up about 5 minutes before we came on the air here. So before you download the detailed slides that are going to be in the chat, give it a few more minutes, and I will let folks know when they are there and complete and up to date. But it's a really good detailed background on pretty much every race you could care about. So what happened on election night and beyond? Basically, I think there are three sort of overriding trends, and typically in a presidential election, you sort of have it break one way or another. And the reason we got the result we got here is because it really, each side did well in particular areas. So three things I want to point out. For Republicans, Trump had already developed in 2016, significant rural outreach and put a lot of effort into getting people to the polls in rural America. Obviously, that's what brought him over the line to a great extent, along with his work in the suburbs in 2016. In 2020, he managed to juice his rural output by 6% over 2016. So if anybody didn't vote in rural America, I will be surprised. I mean, he really got everybody out there, and the rural vote, in large part, helped him keep it as close as he did. But also, really, if you want the story of the House of Representatives and the two Senate seats that Democrats thought they were going to capture, that they have not and don't look like they're going to, the rural vote is huge in all of those areas. And Catherine mentioned Colin Peterson. He's a great example, but there are lots of rural seats that you look at that are either still being contested or have flipped. And obviously, Senator Tillis will remain Senator Tillis, assuming he does. Senator Collins remaining in the Senate, as Sarah Gideon has conceded, in part because of that rural effort. The second thing that Republicans did better than Democrats on election night is understanding the Hispanic vote. Obviously, you've kind of probably read about this already, but the Hispanic vote has been overly simplified, frankly, by both parties over the years, as a monolithic entity. And what the Republican National Committee and the Trump campaign did very, very well is to understand the dynamic between different nationality groups, from Colombians, Cubans, and sort of other key nationality groups, particularly in Florida, that broke for the president, at least men did, versus Latinas who broke broadly against the president. So there are going to be some interesting dinner conversations at Latin American tables over the next week to 2 weeks, I am sure, on who did you vote for? But obviously that was a strong play for the president and Republicans, and helped, particularly as Catherine referenced, in the two Southeastern Florida House seats as well. Finally, probably the headline for the night, the flip in the suburbs. Vice President Biden outperformed Hillary Clinton's numbers in the suburbs by 13%. And if you look at any of the suburban counties that are still being counted, and those, for instance, the signal counties nationally, Bucks County, Pennsylvania, for instance, you're seeing huge upswings for the vice president from what Hillary Clinton did. And that is why we kind of know, the question was asked, well, how do you know Arizona is going to stay in the Democratic column? It's been called by Fox News first on election night, as well as by AP now. And that really is based on where the votes are left to be counted, and how votes have broken in that county. Now, obviously the Trump campaign, and I think some of my Republican colleagues here believe they still got a shot in Arizona. That may be the case, we'll have to see. But those suburban votes in places like Arizona, which is often described as, the rest of the state is described as a suburb of Phoenix, were really, really critical at the end of the day for Biden. And if he is declared the winner of the race at the end of the day, that is where he will have won the race. So that's where things stand as we speak right now. I'm just going to go look at questions here for a second, see if there's anything we want to follow up on, because we have about 9. So there's a question about the Georgia runoffs in a two-way race. How are we thinking about Loeffler as well as Senator Perdue versus their opponents? Let me start there before I kick it back to the panel, just by saying traditionally, our colleague in our Atlanta office, Robert Highsmith, is one of the top lobbyists down there. He would say traditionally, if Biden is president in January 5th or is president-elect January 5th, that the edge would go to the incumbents there, the Republicans, as a reaction to that. But Stacey Abrams has built a turnout machine, obviously, over the last 2 years. If Biden is going to win the presidency in Georgia, which looks at least like a strong possibility at this point, then obviously Georgia Dems have done a really good job building out their infrastructure. So I don't think we're in the normal situation where we can just assume Perdue and Loeffler are going to be okay. And obviously you add on to that the tens of millions of dollars, if not $100 million that will be spent on those two races over the next 2 months. And it becomes a bit of a wild card. So I don't think anybody in either party is calling that race one way or another right now, but panel thoughts there? Okay. Crickets.
I would agree that it's with Robert's assessment and give an edge to the Republicans. I mean, Loeffler was running against not just the Democrat, but also Doug Collins, and with him out of the mix, I think that's got to help her.
Yeah, but the wild card there is how much is Soros going to throw into this thing, and in terms of and some of the and Steyer and Soros in the runoffs, and that's the big concern I have in terms of retaining the Republicans there.
Jim, I got a follow-up question for you. Any significant state judgeship changes that you've seen so far that folks should be aware of on the judicial front in terms of?
I haven't seen any significant flips in the judgeships. Nothing that rings a bell anyway. One interesting on the legislative front was Wisconsin. They had a chance to have a supermajority in the legislature, and that was thwarted. So now that they don't have a veto-proof majority, they won't have a veto-proof majority in Wisconsin, but nothing on the judgeship side.
Okay.
Can I just say about
Dimitri,
Arizona? I'm sorry.
Yep.
Just real quick on Arizona and the presidency. When I looked this morning, 90% of the vote was in, and Biden was leading Trump by about 47,000 votes. I'm looking now on the Politico website, and it still says 90% of the vote is in, but they've had a dump of a number of votes. The lead is smaller for Biden. The question is Trump going to run out of runway? So Trump is making up the space, the votes, but it's not clear that there's going to be enough for him to make up is he going to just run out of votes to do that? So.
For Catherine and Dimitri, we have a question here. The Senate Republican organizational meetings, will those happen next week, or timing of announcement of committee chairs in the House and the Senate?
Well, I defer a little bit to Dimitri. You want to start with the Senate?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to set all the chairmen in place in areas where it changes based on majority or minority. You will have certainly discussions ongoing, and some committees like the Senate Energy Committee, where Senator Murkowski is term limited out in the majority or minority, will have a change in leadership, right? Others, folks have some time left in the minority, I believe. And I think that's going to have to probably wait until we're done with the runoff to fully play out.
Okay. There's one really good question here, Jim. I'm thinking of you here. Can folks on this panel address the Trump Republican field operation? Do we know yet whether their off-cited voter registration efforts made a big difference in increased turnout for Trump and the Republicans, or was it largely party switching like some have claimed?
I think I'll use Pennsylvania as the barometer here. I think there was a significant amount of new voters coming into Pennsylvania. I mean, we saw, significant turnout in the suburbs of Philadelphia this time, and Biden was trending far ahead of where Hillary Clinton was. But the reason why this actually stayed close in Pennsylvania is the uptick, like you said, in rural voters. And I think we registered a lot of new voters in Pennsylvania on the Republican side, and that made a huge difference. And I would say that's probably the trend across states like Pennsylvania that have strong suburban areas and very large rural areas. as well.
So we're getting some really good questions. I appreciate this, gang. Can you touch on shy Trump and shy Biden voters with respect to polling, and why were the polls so off? Let me just start there by saying I don't think this panel is going to be able to answer the question why the polls were so off right now. I think political scientists are going to be spending, the next year looking at that. It was a little bit more obvious in 2016 because we weren't adjusting for education level as one of our crosscutters in polling. But almost all the major polling operations did that this time. And so the question is, what was another confounding variable? As we referenced, grouping Hispanics together is probably not something pollsters can do anymore. And that will certainly get looked at. But they apparently were weighting rural voters and white working class voters more than they did in the past, and they still missed. So, there's work to be done there that is beyond the capability of those of us on this panel. And my guess is we're 6 months to a year out from having a thorough understanding on that. But thoughts from Jim and Beth in terms of shy Trump, shy Biden voters?
Well, we saw that. I mean, again, in the swing state of Pennsylvania, we saw that significantly, in the polling, and even internal polling that I had seen on both sides of the aisle had the thing a little closer than what the national polls did, but still somewhere between 4 and 6. And, they were wrong again. And I think a lot of that has to do with folks not responding to polls or folks not being willing to say who they're voting for. And, I think that this is more of a Trump phenomenon than anything else. I don't know that it's something that carries on into the future, but I think that, certainly a Trump phenomenon for sure.
I definitely do think, though, there were some shy Biden voters, in the other parts of the country, like in Arizona. So I think it will be interesting to see if this is a phenomenon that continues in the future. But I definitely think we saw a lot of that in places like Arizona.
So I've got one last question, which is a good transition to our next panel. Catherine, it's not my question, I promise, but quote, what's with Kevin McCarthy supporting Trump's fraud narrative, end quote.
His fraud, who's that? Is that a Peter Molinaro question?
It is not. Calling out Peter. It is not, it is somebody else.
I don't try to explain what people do. I mean, I've heard anecdotally, I've heard stories. I have to admit, I did not watch the president's press conference yesterday. It's a little bit of a mental health issue for me. But anyway, I'm sure there is some fraud, but I think we all have to, that will be dealt with in the courts to the extent that it can be shown and proven. And at the end of the day, we as Americans, we're all hoping we get the best results and that nobody's cheating and that we count all the ballots we're supposed to be count. And I think that's where we need to end up.
All right. Thanks very much, panel one. We're only running a few minutes behind. I feel like I'm doing my job. I am counseled to tell you that our current version, our latest version of the slides are up and in your chat box. So if you want to go get those, they're there for you. And they will give you much more detailed data, individual race drilling down. And hope those are helpful and you enjoy those. With that, I want to introduce two really smart political lawyers. We've got Charles Borden and Krista Lacey, who are a bipartisan pair. Chris is former counsel for Senator John Warner of Virginia and leads our political law practice at Holland and Knight. And Charles Borden on the D side has worked on the presidential campaign in the primary for one of the aspirants and teaches the J term for political law at Harvard. So obviously smart guy. Let me start off handing it off to Chris and we'll go from there.
Well, thank you, Rich, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Charles and I are going to talk about the legal and constitutional issues that exist at this point in time with the presidential race. As Rich mentioned, we're both part of the political law group, and that means that we do legal work in the areas of campaign finance, lobbying disclosure, government ethics, and election law. So the situation on the legal front is somewhat fluid at this point. There is a lot going on. There have been lawsuits in, by my count, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, and there's a recount request pending in Wisconsin. We may be headed, I think Georgia announced earlier that we will be heading to a recount in Georgia, and the way that Arizona is trending, perhaps that could be an additional recount. So there's a lot of activity. And I think the key to understanding what is going on is discerning, is this activity going to lead to any sort of meaningful change in any of these states? Is it going to change the outcome of any of these elections? And that's basically the standard that the courts are going to use. For example, if there's a 75,000 vote margin and there's 10,000 votes that are legally suspect in some way, I think a judge is going to be very reluctant to wade into a situation like that. There could be legitimate issues with those 10,000 votes, but if it's not going to change the outcome of the race, it's probably not something the courts are going to wade into in any sort of significant way. And at this point, it doesn't seem like any of these states are a good candidate to actually move the needle using the legal system. That could change. There always could be some issue that comes up. But at this point in time, it seems like there's a lot of activity, and it seems unlikely that any of it is going to lead to a meaningful change in any of these states. So it's worth keeping an eye on. My guess is that there will be legal issues and recount issues that continue over the next several days and weeks. But I think that if the news reports are correct, and there's going to be a call of some kind related to Pennsylvania today, it kind of makes these issues somewhat moot. So we'll have to see what the announcement is in Pennsylvania. But that's the basic read of the situation. And to the question we had earlier, Rich, about the minority leader in the House, his statements related to these legal efforts, I think it is interesting to look at the range of statements that Republicans have made about these legal challenges. And I would say on the whole, they have been pretty measured, and most of them include a statement along the lines of all legal votes need to be counted. So it seems like the president and his campaign are on a bit of a short leash when it comes to Republican leadership. Some are very supportive of these legal challenges, and I think McCarthy falls into that category. Senator Graham falls into that category, but others like Senator McConnell and former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie and others have made very lukewarm statements about where this is headed. So I think that's a good barometer of where we are. Some people have tried to draw the comparison to Florida in 2000. There's a number of ways that this situation is different. Some people have said, we need, the president needs someone like James Baker to step into this situation and really take control. And I think that it speaks volumes that so far there's really nobody like that. And so this seems like a very different situation than 2000 in Florida, where we were really focused on one state. And I think most notably in Florida in 2000, there was no issue related to the initial count of the votes. There was no attempt to stop that count. It was only the recount portion of the Florida election that had been challenged. So I think there's a number of ways to distinguish the current situation from 2000, but my read of the situation as it stands, and again, something unforeseen could happen, but it seems very unlikely that any of these current legal challenges are going to have a substantial effect on the outcome of this election. And again, I think that's going to be the key as to whether courts are willing to wade into this political matter. Charles, do you have a different view of the situation?
No, Chris, I don't. I would thank you, Rich. Thanks everyone for joining us today. As a headline matter, to echo what Chris was saying, I think, given where we are right now, we've got a lot of litigation going on, but there does not appear to be anything yet that looks similar to what we saw in 2000 in terms of litigation that sort of consumes weeks and throws the outcome in a particular state in doubt, or an outcome of the election in doubt for a number of weeks. Just to sort of elaborate on a couple of points that Chris was making, you do have a lot of cases going on in the states that Chris identified, and they broadly are sort of falling into what I would say are three buckets, one of which is more or less done. The first was that there were a number of suits brought in the right after the election that were really aimed at sort of slowing down the count, and usually those suits were brought basically on the grounds of trying to allow for greater access by the campaign, by representatives, to watching the vote count. And you had suits like that in Michigan and in Pennsylvania and in Georgia. There were some issues about that in Arizona and Nevada as well. Most of those challenges were unsuccessful. A few of them were, but at this point, the votes have been, largely counted in the places where these challenges were brought, and these issues have either been resolved in the sense the case was dismissed, or resolved in the sense something's been worked out. Going forward, there are really sort of two types of cases to watch. And again, big picture, as Chris was saying, I don't think either of these is likely to go particularly long. One would be a sort of a Bush v. Gore style litigation, again, something like what we saw in 2000, and a classic sort of election contest. And as Chris was saying, that really requires a situation like we had in Florida in 2000, where you have a decisive state and the outcome turns on a couple of thousand votes at most. Right now, given the number of states that are outstanding and where the vote counts are likely to end up, you have a couple of states that might end up in that situation, but really not. It's unlikely you're going to have a decisive number that would. And in terms of things like recounts, recounts happen, election contests happen, but by and large, you don't remove more than a couple hundred votes, maybe 1,000, 2,000 at the outer bounds. And so when you're talking about some of these states that we've been hearing about over the last couple of days, you're talking about close margins, absolutely, but margins more in the 20,000 vote range. And you just saw, as Chris said, there's likely to be a recount in Wisconsin. There was a recount in Wisconsin 4 years ago when the margin was about the same, and it moved 300 votes. It's not. So generally speaking, you're not going to see the kinds of Bush v. Gore style recount litigation unless you're talking about really close margins. And by really close, I mean, again, within a couple of thousand votes, and in a jurisdiction where it's going to be decisive. I think the only other type of litigation to sort of keep an eye out for, and honestly, as Chris was saying, given how things are shaking out, this is probably not going to be that significant, but it was something that got a lot of coverage, and there was a lot of litigation prior to the election, is this issue about late arriving absentee ballots. And the issue there is something that sort of goes to a constitutional question. It has to do with, essentially, to the extent that various states created some sort of change in their absentee ballot standards, liberalize them in certain ways to deal with pandemic-related issues. To the extent that those changes were done by a state executive officer or by a state Supreme Court and not done by the state legislature, it raises some constitutional questions over whether or not that comports with what is required under Article 2 of the Constitution. There is an argument there, going back to Bush v. Gore, actually. There was a concurring opinion in Bush v. Gore which discussed this, that basically says that the state legislature is the only authority when it comes to deciding how a state counts ballots and decides who will be, how to apportion electors in a presidential election. And so to the extent that another body in state government weighs in through judicial action, through an executive order, there's an argument that violates the federal constitution. There was litigation in North Carolina and in Pennsylvania and in Wisconsin prior to election day, challenging some of these efforts to count, in particular, absentee ballots that were postmarked prior to Election Day and received afterwards. That issue is still out there, but I think sort of taking a step back, that's only going to be an issue if those late arriving absentee ballots are enough to actually affect the outcome of any state. And right now, that doesn't appear to be the case, perhaps in North Carolina. But as Rich was sort of alluding to earlier, if you look at sort of the swath of states that are out there, even if that is the case in North Carolina, it's not going to be decisive, or it's unlikely to be decisive. And I think really sort of the big point to keep in mind with all of this is the one that Chris was making earlier, which is that courts don't typically like to get into the middle of these elections unless there's a real need for them to decide it. They don't tend to reach out to try to get into the middle of these things. That was true in Bush v. Gore, if you remember how that litigation went. Initially, the court sort of punted on the first Bush v. Gore argument, and before it had its second decisive ruling. Again, likely to be the case here too, which is that ultimately, unless you're talking about a world where one of these lawsuits could really be decisive, there's a state where if the lawsuit is successful, it will actually change the outcome in that state and change the outcome in the election. It's unlikely that the courts are going to reach into the matter and want to decide that on substantive grounds. So Chris, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts, or Rich, I guess we can turn it over to questions.
We've got some questions here, so let me go to questions, because again, these are really good. One is you all have gone through and done a good job going over the straight legal mechanism. Obviously, as we all know, the Electoral College is an odd being. Can you kind of just walk through for us the process over the next 2 months until the Electoral College process is finalized, and where there may be opportunities for conflict?
Sure. Chris, I'll start and then maybe turn it over to you. I mean, I think the first point would be on this Article 2 issue, and this is something that people have talked about, and there was actually a statement by the legislative leadership in Pennsylvania earlier today on this point. There is an argument if you take sort of Article 2, this idea that the state legislatures are the ones who decide how a state's going to apportion its electors very seriously, that the state legislature could unilaterally decide to change the rules right now and say, we're going to award our state's electors to whatever candidate we want to award them to. And so there has been some thought that in an environment where there's a lot of question over who has actually won the vote in a particular state, where there are allegations of voter fraud or the illegitimate votes being cast, that state legislatures could step in prior to the date when the Electoral College would meet and award the state's electors to the candidate they want to award them to. And you had again a statement earlier today from the Pennsylvania legislative leadership where the Republican leadership of the state Senate came out and very clearly said they're not going to do that in Pennsylvania, regardless of sort of what happened. It made a very sort of authoritative statement on that front. But we are in a period now between the actual vote counting and when the Electoral College meets, where if a state legislature wants to get involved and wants to just award electors to a particular candidate, there are some good, or at least reasonable constitutional arguments that they could do that. And again, that was something, if you think back to 2000 and Bush v. Gore, that was something that was mooted at the time there as well. Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about how the Electoral College process works?
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Charles. So there's a number of milestones over the next couple of months, primarily in December, where the Electoral College has to meet, has to make certain certifications and so forth. All of that culminates in a joint session of Congress on January 6th with the Vice President presiding, so Vice President Pence presiding over this joint session to essentially certify the electoral votes. And to the extent there is any remaining controversy with the vote, those controversies could be decided by Congress. And so 4 years ago, for example, There was an issue raised by the House about the electoral votes, but there was not a second from the Senate. And so nothing further happened with that particular concern. So there is a mechanism to resolve these issues. It is a joint session of Congress. Interestingly, we heard from Beth earlier about the runoff, two runoff elections in Georgia, which is the day before. And so we don't think any of this will carry over until January 6th, but if there was a remaining controversy of some kind related to the Electoral College, it could potentially hinge on the outcome of those two special elections, which are happening the day before. So let's hope that we don't have that much drama, but the timeline is interesting, and it's always interesting when you have a sitting vice president presiding in this scenario, because very often they are either announcing good news from their perspective, or they are essentially announcing their successor. So it could make for a dramatic moment, but there is a process to resolve these issues, and over the next several weeks we'll have a better feel for whether there are any remaining electoral college or electoral vote issues.
Thank you, gentlemen. Another good follow-up question here. On what ground is the Trump camp taking its Pennsylvania suit to SCOTUS? Since election laws are written by the state, wouldn't the state Supreme Court be the proper arbiter?
So this goes back to the Article 2 argument I was just talking about. So the idea here would be that ultimately what happened in Pennsylvania was that the state Supreme Court said that under the state constitution, you needed to expand the deadline for receiving absentee ballots to account for pandemic conditions. And what the Article 2 argument is to say, under the federal constitution, the state Supreme Court cannot decide to do that. It has to be the state legislature if any sort of COVID-related pandemic relief was going to occur, and the state legislature did not choose to do that. So the argument is, even though it's a state law, and even though under a normal course, the state law would be interpreted by the state Supreme Court, this argument is that the federal constitution, when it comes to presidential election, precludes any state government entity other than the state legislature from adjusting the rules.
In the follow-up to that, do we know how many ballots are at play in that case?
So this is actually, I think, the interesting thing, which is that the rule was extended from ballots need to be received on election day to 3 days afterwards. So today, basically they would need to be postmarked by election day, received by today to count. It looks, and it's still a little bit up in the air, that the number of these late arriving absentee ballots is actually pretty small, and will not be dispositive in terms of being able to move the outcome one way or another. So it's not clear yet exactly what that number will be. We'll know, I guess, after today, when the new deadline has passed, but it doesn't appear to be a huge number at present.
Again, Charles and, oops, sorry. Chris, is that you?
No.
Okay. For Charles and Chris, has there been any evidence in any of the contentious states where we've seen clear indications of fraud or vote rigging of any sort? And if so, what form does it take?
Chris, do you want to take that?
Sure. So based on what I've seen, I haven't seen any credible allegations in that regard. That doesn't mean that they don't exist or that there hasn't been fraud. I think it's fairly normal for a very small amount of that to go on, and so that's probably the case here. But I'm not aware of any viable accusations related to widespread fraud. Charles, have you heard anything different?
No, I mean, the allegations, there were some allegations about, count in states where the deadline for accepting absentee ballots has already passed, of, allowing certain absentee ballots to be counted when the deadline had already run. There's been some allegations. The most extensive complaint I think the campaign has filed on this issue yet is in Nevada, and they filed a suit last night, which had a bunch of different allegations. Most of them seem to go with allegations of, signature matches with absentee ballots not matching, and that people, casting absentee ballots for somebody else. But thus far, I haven't seen a lot of them getting traction. I think, I think a hearing is scheduled on the Nevada complaint later today. So I guess we'll see then. But yeah, thus far, nothing that seems to have really gotten any traction.
Final question for this panel. How do you see this playing out? And if the vote count stays where it is, how do you see, President Trump sort of exiting here?
Well, it's unclear what happens from this point on, at least as it relates to President Trump. He has indicated his belief that there is extensive fraud in this election. We'll see if any of that is proven. There is a blueprint for others that have been in his situation. In 2000, we saw how Vice President Gore handled the situation. Prior to that, we saw President George H.W. Bush, who did not win a second term, how he handled that process. And then prior to that, Jimmy Carter in a very similar situation. So there is a blueprint. Whether the president plans to follow that blueprint is anybody's guess. But he has certainly indicated that he is not planning to give up on these legal challenges anytime soon. And we'll see if any of the calls that we're expecting in the near future changes that. For example, if Fox News makes a call with regard to Pennsylvania, as I think you mentioned earlier, Rich, they made the first call on Arizona on election night. If Fox News makes the call related to Pennsylvania, it would be interesting to see how that changes the president's outlook and strategy, if at all. But I think it's a huge question mark how he's going to handle this. I would expect that this is going to drag on for a while. But it's just speculation at this point, right? I really don't think we know how exactly he will handle the situation.
Just to echo what Chris is saying, yeah, I think there's a lot of question about exactly how he will handle the situation. I mean, I think one just point to make there is that there is a question. I know some folks will be talking about this later about how that might impact a transition, and there are some legal issues there. And this is an area that Chris and I also sort of work in terms of our practice, and issues related to people going into government or coming out of government. And there are certain things about the Presidential Transition Act that get triggered when the GSA administrator determines that a victor has emerged. And I think it is certainly possible that some of this litigation may affect when that exact determination is made. So that is something to watch, and how President Trump handles some of these issues if it does turn out that he has been defeated by Vice President Biden. It could have an impact on some of these, how this transition goes ahead.
There's one last question which I got to ask here, just because it's such a good question. If the Republican legislature, I presume this is Pennsylvania, were to present an opposition slate of electors for President Trump, presumably, regardless of any specific fraud or any vote count, wouldn't the Supreme Court confirm that as a correct role for the state legislature?
Theoretically, yes. I mean, I guess the question is that we would have sort of an unprecedented situation there, but there are definitely some justices who, in the litigation over the last few weeks, have indicated that they might be sympathetic to that argument. I think it'd be hard to know exactly what would happen if that kind of case made it to the Supreme Court. And there are some very significant, alternative issues that would come into play there. As I don't think the Supreme Court wants to get into the business of deciding these types of cases, but there are definitely some justices who are on the court who, in the decisions that have been made over the last couple of weeks, have indicated that they would agree with that argument.
And I think with all of these issues, there's a difference between a purely legal or constitutional analysis and a practical or public relations analysis. And I think both are important. We saw that in 2000. What James Baker and Warren Christopher were doing was overseeing an effort that included both of those elements. And so I think something like that may fall into the category of from a strictly legal or constitutional perspective, it could be done, but what would the public reaction would be? How would the press react? How would the public react? I think that has to figure into that larger analysis. And my guess is that to the extent that Pennsylvania or any other legislature are contemplating something along those lines, part of that analysis has to be the practical side, which is, are we going to cause the entire system to collapse under its own weight by pushing some of these legal arguments to sort of a logical extreme? And so I think that plays into this, but it is a very, very interesting question. We may or may not get the answer to it this year, but it is a very interesting question, and I just think there's more to the analysis than just the purely legal and constitutional in that case.
All right, thank you, panel. We appreciate it. And we had some really good questions here, so I appreciate it. And if more come in, again, we can kind of go backwards with the panel. But as Admiral Stockdale was, who's that you ask? Ross Perot's vice presidential candidate in 1992, that's who, was famous for having been quoted, "Who am I? How did I get here?" Okay, well, who are these new members of Congress? What is their makeup? What do we need to know about them? And this is really the beginning of our effort to help you think through in your mind how to advocate before the next Congress based on who the new members are. So a little bit of a demographic breakdown and a sense of background and who these people are. And with that, we're going to go to Alex Worth, the head honcho for Quorum.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Rich, and thank you to the entire H&K team for that very insightful overview. And that's part of the reason why we love this partnership and love this event, is we can bring you all some of the data and statistics and complement that with the incredible perspective and analysis from the H&K team. What I'm going to do here is spend about 10 to 15 minutes walking you through the demographics of the new Congress and what we know so far. We'll start at the top by saying, with the disclaimer, there's still a number of races that are waiting to be called. And the data that is in here is only using information from races that the AP had called as of this morning when we put the finishing touches on this presentation. But again, the goal here is to give a sense of who exactly are these individuals that we are all going to spend the next 2 years advocating and talking and discussing. So first off, high level is that we're expecting about 55 new members of Congress in the 117th Congress. That's across both the House and the Senate, representing about 10.3% of the Congress. The big narrative here is that this is significantly fewer members of Congress than we had in the 116th freshman class. So there was a tremendous amount of discussion 2 years ago focused on the 111 new members of Congress that were coming in. And in comparison, as we look at the 117th Congress, we are seeing a fairly significant decrease in the number of freshmen. Good news here is this should make all of your jobs easier in terms of introducing yourselves to the new members, as well as towards starting to form and build the relationships where that uphill number of individuals involved is going to be significantly less. And given our remote, socially distanced world, probably a good thing as well, as I know that everyone is going to be evaluating and re-innovating their advocacy strategies as it comes to introducing those new members. In terms of the breakdown, Republicans make up 69% of the new freshman members of Congress, 34 in the House, 4 in the Senate, compared to 17 freshman Democrats in the 117th Congress. So as you think about who are the organizations that you need to be a part of, what are the communities that you need to be doing outreach to, as you're thinking about a balanced strategy going into forming long-term relationships, that focus really should be on the Republican side of the aisle as you're wanting to get to know freshmen, even though obviously Democrats, we expect to maintain control of the House. But a very significant number of freshman Republicans to be expected in the 117th Congress. Where are the Senate freshmen from? These are the states that you are seeing new United States senators be elected. So obviously a big focus on the West as well as in the South. You heard earlier, we're still waiting on the results from Georgia, but looking at welcoming a total of about 7 new United States senators. and then a number of new House freshmen from across the country. So the ones are obviously states where you'll have one from a particular party, but also there's some states like Texas welcoming, and Florida welcoming 5 new Republican House freshmen. The big interesting story here is that the House freshmen and Senate freshmen have much more political experience than we saw in 2018. So this is a breakdown of what was their background before they were elected to the US Congress. And in 2018, only 40%, 5% of House and Senate freshmen had some sort of political experience. So federal legislative or executive experience now is about 13%. 23% of the freshmen used to be state legislators, 14% were local, 10% state executive, and 37% have no political experience. Takeaway here is that the individuals that you're going to be interacting with are likely going to be a lot more politically savvy and will have actually had some experience governing. Probably a good thing, as we're looking at fairly tight majorities on both the House and the Senate. And so there's lots of opportunities for being able to engage with them. But also, for the most part, they know the ropes of what does it mean to govern. Obviously, it will be up to all of us to make sure that we give them a very good understanding and help them learn the new processes with the new Congress. A couple of examples of that. One, Kate Kamak, who is the former Deputy Chief of Staff to Representative Ten Yoho. She led Rep. Yoho's efforts to open up a number of VA clinics. She's going to be the youngest Republican woman in Congress and is an example of one of these new members of Congress who is coming in with previous political experience. Another one of these is Richie Torres, who's joining Moriarty Jones as one of the first Black members of Congress who identifies as gay. He has previous experience with the Council's Committee on Public Housing and the Committee on Oversight and Investigations from his experience at the New York City Council. So again, another example, taking that political experience up to the Congress. And then the last person is Yvette Harrell, who won in the New Mexico's 2nd Congressional District. She previously served in the New Mexico State Legislature, focused on health and a lot of work around legal and elections related work. Again, another example here of where that previous political experience can help inform what might be some of their priorities. What were the things that they worked on at the city council, at the executive level, at the state level, and what is that going to inform their major interests? All of that information is publicly available, and we would encourage you to be thoughtful as you're working on approaching them, given they do have political track records and issue backgrounds. What are the areas to be reaching out? The big story is focused on the number of women in the 117th Congress. So 132 women will serve across both the House and the Senate in the 117th Congress, which we're expecting to be a record number of women. So about 100 of those come from the Democratic side, 32 coming from the Republican side. And the big narrative, as you've heard, is that Republican women are on pace to beat the historic record of 25 Republican female members in the House. So that was the number that they're pushing to beat. Right now, it's about 24. There's a number of races that are still outstanding with a fairly significant likelihood that Republican freshmen and women will pick up a number more to beat that and have the be able to beat that historic number of 25. 32, of course, is across the House and the Senate. On the Republican side, there was one pickup of a Republican woman on the Senate, but also a loss with Martha McSally in Arizona. So really excellent work. Obviously, all eyes here are on Elise Stefanik and the work that she's been doing to encourage more Republican women to run. But the results here are quite significant. This is the states that are represented by women in the US Senate. So you see a fair amount Northeast, also on the West, and then in the Midwest and upper Northwest. Obviously, we're still waiting on Georgia. And then this is a breakdown of just the number of women in Congress and the House of Representatives across the country. And I think one of the most exciting things here is that you see it's representing a larger number of states across the entire country as we see more and more women elected to Congress. Veterans, we have 13 newly elected veterans, bringing the total number of veterans in the 117th Congress to 85. The big narrative is that we had more veterans run for Congress this year, but fewer will end up serving in the 117th Congress. And the reason for that is that there were a number of retirements of senators and older members of Congress who had previous experience as a veteran. And so that brought the number down. The breakdown by party here, 57 Republicans have previously had military service and serve in Congress, 28 of Democratic veterans in the 117th Congress, again, for that total of 85. A couple examples of this, obviously Mark Kelly was an astronaut and a retired Navy captain, obviously elected in Arizona. And then when it comes to defeated incumbents, we had 10 incumbents who were defeated from the 116th Congress. The big narrative here, no House Republican incumbent has lost re-election so far. We've got a number of races that are still out there to be called. There were Republican members of Congress who who resigned or retired before, but Republicans running in competitive races only saw 2 defeats, and both of those were on the Senate side so far with Martha McSally and Cory Gardner. Again, these are only individual races that have been called by the AP so far. So could be subject to change, but as the narrative notes and Catherine was talking about earlier, very good night for House Republicans, much more challenging for House Democrats who saw 8 of their Democratic incumbents defeated and 1 in the Senate so far with Doug Jones, although obviously more votes to be counted. The average service of a defeated incumbent was about 2.4 terms. Asterisk there obviously is that will vary as we are waiting on more of the results. The biggest notable departure that I think is just worth highlighting is Colin Peterson. He was in Congress for 15 years, was a Democrat, chair of the House Agriculture Committee, very involved in agricultural policy, who did lose his bid for re-election. He was somebody who worked frequently across the aisle, and certainly that will have a big impact as it comes to agricultural policy in 2021. Last item of analysis that we put together that I think is really interesting is the number of senators who've served at least 1 term with then Senator Joe Biden. And that total is 31, so about 31% of the US Congress, of the US Senate has actually had experience directly working with Biden in the Senate. And I think when you look at a Senate that's likely to be 50-50 or 51-49 or 50-48, those relationships are going to matter and present an opportunity for advocacy of working to both insert policies and also have an opportunity to reach the White House. So this is a timeline. Joe Biden was elected to the United States Senate in 1973. He was followed by Senator Leahy in 1975, Senator Grassley in 1981, Mitch McConnell in 1985. So you look at this, they've spent a lot of time together in the Senate and do obviously have a relationship through those many years of experience. We are going to see over the course of the next 2 years how strong that relationship is and can that actually get legislative outcomes, but it does exist. Senator Richard Shelby of Alabama, 1987, Dianne Feinstein and Patty Murray elected in 1993, Senator Inhofe in 1995, Collins, Durbin, Reed, and Wyden in 1997, Senator Schumer, Senator Crapo in 1999, in 2000, Maria Cantwell, Carper, and Stabenow. 2003, Cornyn, Graham, Murkowski, Burr, Thune in 2005, and then obviously a number in 2007. Won't go through and read them all. But the big point here is that he does have relationships. And obviously, as we look at who Joe Biden is as a politician, he appreciates those relationships, calls people, knows backgrounds, and has spent so much time doing this that he's going to have many more than either President Trump or President Obama had, just given that significant experience, which opens up a number of opportunities for advocacy. So that brings us to the end of the information that we've prepared for this session, but really just wanted to give the deep dive on what exactly are the demographics and where those might present some opportunities. All of these slides are available, quorum.us, webinars, post-election briefing, and we'll post them there. So you're welcome to use them, but hopefully provide some information as we think about what 2021 and the 117th Congress will bring. With that, I'm really excited to turn it back over to Rich to talk about now the policy side. And we've got an incredible panel from Holland and Knight ready to go around what is these election results and these demographics going to mean. So with that, Rich, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Alex. And I do want to mention that the quorum slides that Alex just went through are going to be available at the end of this session on Quorum's website at quorum.us/webinars/post-election briefing. So you can go to the Quorum website and go through those or download them at the end of the session. So our next session is navigating 2021, overview of the next Congress and the prospective Biden administration. Again, we will kind of take Q&A as we go through this. I will just note a number of you have asked policy questions as opposed to election data questions, which we've tried to answer already. I will go back and grab those policy questions as we move forward here. So I didn't ignore you. I was just waiting for the perfect moment in time, and here it is. With that, let me hand over and reintroduce Beth and sorry, I'm mixing up my my slides here. Beth and Catherine. And Beth starting out with the administration. I am definitely mixing up my slides. Sorry. Beth, Shauna, and Ron Klein starting out on the administration, and then we'll move over to Congress with Jim Davis, Catherine, and our two Senate leads, Todd Wooten and Dimitri Karakitsos. But Beth, you want to kick it off? Or Ron, maybe I think you were going to kick it off with a look at sort of an overview of the administration, and then Beth and Shauna.
Sure. Well, thank you, Rich, and it's a pleasure to be here and appreciate the opportunity. A few of us have had the opportunity to serve in Congress and serve in the House of Representatives, served on Financial Services Committee, and was part of the New Democrat group, along with Jim Davis, who's going to speak in a few minutes. So we're able to get a pretty good understanding of many of the members in the House and the Senate, of course, along with the other colleagues that have spoken so far. I'm just going to give a little brief overview to sort of kick it off on sort of the election and the results. If Vice President Biden wins, and we'll just use that assumption just for purposes of this beginning of this conversation, I think the watchword will probably be split government. And we understand that based on what you've heard so far, if Mitch McConnell hangs on, and obviously there's two Senate races in Georgia that could be the hanging the balance of a 50-50 Senate, or it could be giving him a couple extra seats in the Senate for Republican control. If it's 50-50, obviously the Vice President has the final vote, and if it's not 50-50, Mitch McConnell would be the person who sets the agenda. So split government means obviously he will be the control of the Senate on the Republican side on the agenda. Nancy Pelosi, although the numbers, as you've heard, are much closer than they were before, she will still be, I believe, will still have be the Speaker and in control of the House of Representatives. She is going to have to manage a new Democrat caucus, which is sort of the pro-business, middle-of-the-road Democrats, sort of fiscally conservative, strong on business, socially maybe more progressive, and the Progressive Caucus, which is the more liberal side of the Democratic Party. I've seen her before, as many of you have. She is a master. She's very good at what she does, and I think we can expect that she will do the best she can to keep the group in line as best she can. But that may affect some of the issues that come out of the House. So the split government means that it will be the description I think that Alex just gave, and it's interesting because I think if you think of Donald Trump's split government scenario, he was sort of his own man, and sometimes he get along with the Senate, sometimes he get along once in a while with they kind of deal through Mnuchin with the House, but it was not a more traditional split government where the partisan sides lined up perfectly. So I think what you're going to see here, if Donald Trump was sort of the art of the deal guy, I think Joe Biden will be more art of the compromise guy. He has a long history, as Alex already indicated, of relationships and understanding the dynamics of the Senate, which may be controlled by Republicans. And that's a big deal because that could give him a little bit of an advantage of understanding how the people think, how they work. He's worked with them. He's worked with in a bipartisan way on many issues. I'm not being naive, of course, in this very partisan environment that we're living through right now. But I think the public certainly is willing to say, hey, listen, enough of the drama, enough of the fighting. Let's get on with things. I think we can expect that COVID would, based on his campaign, would be the first issue he's going to have to work through and take up, and probably use some national leadership to how to deal with the virus. But then the rest of the things, whether it's green energy or taxes or a Dodd-Frank review or transportation. Transportation may be a little easier. That's usually a little less partisan because it usually goes through more of an issue of how do you fund it, but people sort of agree on the need. But the other ones are complicated. And I think that if you have a deadlock, like we've had for a number of years now, what you'll probably see is a default to executive agency action again. And that means that all the agencies that we all deal with at Holland Knight on a regular basis, whether it's the financial service side or transportation or energy, all those things will have an outsized role as opposed to legislation going through. So that's sort of a big picture of where we see the potential split government and Joe Biden's art of the compromise way of doing business.
Beth and Shauna, talk to us a little bit about how you see, the administration staffing out. What do you see the style of governance to be, sort of the balance between, the Hill and the executive branch, as Ron just alluded to? Where are we going?
You want to go or you want me to go?
You can go and I'll follow up with you.
Well, I think first and foremost, we have seen the Biden transition folks have quietly been in place for a little bit, and they have quietly been working to put together their priorities in terms of policy. But I think first and foremost, what we're going to see out of a new administration is the fact that they're going to have to be very focused on rebuilding the federal government, because there are so many jobs at the political level and at the very senior levels of the federal agencies that the top priority is going to be to try to restaff a lot of those positions. So I think the Biden transition did actually launch their website the other day. While it does talk right now only about, right now we're focused on counting the votes. We do know the site as soon as he is the president-elect, that site will go live with a lot of other information. So, from my perspective, I see three legs of the stool in terms of how President-elect Biden is going to move things forward. And a lot of this is with my sort of energy climate lens on, but, first is what can he do from the federal executive, using the power of the executive branch and driving change that way. The second is on the legal side, and regulatory side, what are the regulations that have been put in place that need to be addressed, both either settled from a legal perspective, lawsuits, or if he's going to promulgate new regulations. And then I think the third, which is really important, is the congressional piece and his legislative agenda. And I think so much of how Vice President Biden has put out in terms of his policy agenda has been through the lens of a Build Back Better plan. And I think it's very much going to be a COVID lens, which is we have to address the coronavirus if we're going to address the economy. And so therefore, I think you'll see a fair amount of effort on trying to get control of the virus, and at the same time trying to put some resources and put a lot of money into the economy that do a lot of things, not only create jobs, deal with infrastructure in this country, but at the same time also address another one of the big issues he's talked about, which is climate change. And how do you reduce emissions and reach a net zero economy by 2050 while doing well for the economy? So I think that's kind of big picture through the lens. And with that, I'll turn it over to Shauna.
Sure, thanks, Beth. I pretty much agree with what you've said. I think in the first 100 days, we're going to see him try to really address some of the Trump administration policies that he would like to reverse, like the immigration issue, separating the children from their parents on the border. That's going to be top priority. Coronavirus, in order to deal with the economy. I mean, he ran on the COVID virus, so he's going to have to push hard on that, whether it be legislatively, and making sure that local governments have the funding that they need. Also dealing with stopping the death toll, figuring out how to move forward with a vaccine, and then also just addressing the economic pain that people are dealing with on a national level. So I think that will be at the forefront, number one, day one. And then also as relates to, as Rich questioned, as in regard to, staffing, I think you're going to see a lot of folks off the Hill going into the administration on the House and Senate side. I cannot tell you how many emails that I received from individuals, the different resume banks that are being developed and being pushed to the administration. So I think we're going to actually be looking at how we're going to fill staff's positions on the House and in the Senate, because they're going to, I think the administration needs people who are experienced. We don't have time for on-the-job training. And so a lot of those folks come off the Hill. Initially, we had heard that they're looking at maybe working with lobbyists coming into the administration. We'll see how that plays itself out. But they know that they need experienced folks to get the job done immediately.
I think anyone who knows Vice President Biden knows that he sort of comes at things from a let's bring all the best voices to the table and make decision. But he's very much comes at it from an inclusivity perspective. So I think it is going to be really important to see who he puts around him and who he ultimately nominates. And I think the makeup of the tightness in the Senate, regardless of who's in charge, is going to mean that he's going to have people that can get confirmed. And so I think there's been a lot of concern by some of the more moderate voices that he may nominate a lot of more progressive people. I think that becomes a lot harder and more challenging with the current makeup in the Senate.
I also think too, you can't, you really have to understand he has a relationship with McConnell. It's not like the Obama administration and President Obama. He has a relationship with McConnell. I believe McConnell was maybe one of the only Republicans that actually attended his son Beau's funeral. And so even back in when they were dealing with the financial crisis, McConnell stated, "Thank God I had Joe Biden. I needed a partner to get this through." And so, I know it's a different season, but folks, they have to be able to work together to get some things done. And I think he's going to be able to lean on that relationship that's been established where others didn't have that.
Gang, I'm going to interrupt to go through some administration questions because I guess when you put 400 people on Zoom, you end up getting good questions, or at least a handful of them. No, I'm kidding. You all are doing great. How will foreign governments respond to Biden presidency? I don't know, Ron, I know you have some thoughts on that from your time in Congress. What do you think the change will be here?
Yeah, I served on foreign affairs, Rich, and I think that there is in many parts of the world, there's a longing for a little bit more of a normalcy relationship with the United States. That's bilateral and multilateral treaties. I think multilateral treaties are sort of a watchword. That means, everything from NATO to multiple countries coming together to sort of fight off a particular, whether it's Russia or some other issue in the Far East. I think normalcy is really something they really have always looked to the United States for stability. And I think Donald Trump, in the way he handles things, it's a very much, spontaneous, transactional way, which sometimes works. I think it was a positive thing for the NATO groups to have to put more money into it. I think we can't go back from that. That was a good thing. But I think most of the other things were just really not well regarded. So I think the Biden administration has an opportunity to rebuild, but keep in mind, China and other countries are moving quickly. When we pulled back for the last few years, a lot of other countries to step in. So it'll be interesting to see. But I think that this, if he's elected president, he will be more of someone who I think we can have a more stable relationship with other countries. And hopefully, when you're dealing with issues like Iran or other countries, when you're dealing with terrorist threats or countries that are rogue countries, you want to be able to have large collectives. That's how he thinks, as opposed to we're going to go it alone. He thinks we shouldn't be the policemen of the world, but we need friends around us that work together, and I think that'll play out positive for the United States.
Thanks, Ron. Just going to the next question. What do you, Shauna and Beth, what do you see as a Vice President-elect Harris, should that happen, role in the administration. Obviously, we've seen a strengthening of the vice presidency over the last 20 to 30 years with obviously Al Gore having a strong role in the Clinton administration, Vice President Cheney being a very strong vice president, and Vice President Biden himself being at the president's arm for all the major decisions and playing a major role on everything from the cancer moonshot to related issues. What do you see Kamala's role being here moving forward, assuming a Biden administration?
So I'll take a stab at it, Beth, and then I'll hand it over to you. But, I believe she'll be a very strong vice president, very similar to the relationship that Vice President Biden had with President Obama. He stated that's what he was looking for. And I think, quite honestly, it's what he's going to need. Hopefully, we'll be able to get our arms around COVID. But if not, then he's going to have to really focus in on that. And he's going to need a partner to work with him on some of the other issues like international issues, climate change, social justice issues that she's going to probably have to be the bridge for. And so given her role and personality, I don't see her as a shrinking violet. So I I expect that she will be a true partner in this administration. And she's going to want to do some of the heavy lifting. The other thing is, the vice president, as vice president and the president dealing with COVID, they're going to have to share a lot of the responsibilities. The president being able to fly around the world, or, she's going to have to do some of that just because of the nature of where we are. So I think she'll be very much engaged.
I think that's spot on. And I just think, I suspect you'll see it very much modeled on the way he was as vice president and how President Obama depended on him. And it'll just be interesting to see which pieces of the very large portfolio awaits the incoming president that he would just hand over to her. But I do suspect we'll see a big chunk of policy initiatives just go right to her to handle.
One last question for the panel, and this is probably a Ron question. If Biden prevails here, what's the expected impact of the election from a regulatory perspective on private equity, hedge firms, and the financial services sector generally, given in particular the fact that the election results were not as robust for Democrats as the pre-election polls would have otherwise predicted?
I guess I'll take a shot. I mean, private equity and those types of investing organizations are always interested in the carried interest question. That's been around for a long time, and whether there's a tax change on that, I mean, that's a way of making up some type of revenue loss, but there's been a hard fight on preventing that. At some point when the COVID virus begins to subside, there will no question be a big discussion in the Congress about how we're going to pay for this massive deficit. And we're going to start hearing the deficit hawk conversations, and then we get into tax discussions. How quickly that happens is a big question, but I think from the organizations, the hedge funds, those kinds of things, whether it's on tax issues or regulatory, I would expect the administration to have a conversation about that. So I think those groups need to be ready to have their representation at the table when the committees and or the administration starts that process.
Great, thanks, Ron. I don't want to ignore, obviously the election hasn't been decided, and there's still votes being counted. So I certainly want to focus on the fact that should things somehow turn around here, whether through vote counting or legal means, we have the at least possibilities still of a Trump administration for Dimitri and Krista Lacey, Catherine. Sort of how would you see at this point a second Trump administration? Obviously, it would be coming into power after what would now be a long and contentious battle to get there on a very narrow vote. How would that play out with a likely Republican Senate, Democratic House for another term?
I can start and jump in. I mean, I think you'll see some of the same emphasis from a Trump administration. you know, with working with the Republican Senate to continue confirming judges, which has been obviously a big deal for them in the first term. You know, at the agency level, continuing their kind of deregulatory agenda, and trying to create what they believe is a more kind of friendly business environment, and create more investment in this country and jobs. You know, and I think legislatively, you know, from my perspective, a lot of it is kind of the same as a early Biden administration. We're going to be looking at COVID. We're going to be looking at you know, a COVID package with some sort of stimulus, infrastructure package as well. So I think, you know, those are at least the early priorities there.
Catherine, Chris?
I think that's right. I have to say the president has wanted to do infrastructure since before, I mean, like before he was sworn in, that when he went to then Speaker Ryan and the Republican leadership, that was top of his list. So I would think that would be something he would want to try and get done. I agree COVID is going to continue to be a priority, and we haven't really talked about it that much, but the big question is, will something come in the next couple of weeks, or will something come in the lame duck? And maybe we'll get that in a minute, but you know, McConnell's like, let's just get this done. But I just think we're, notwithstanding the willingness, we still don't know who the president is, and we still don't know who's the Senate. So there may be a way to get that done, but I think the uncertainty about who's in charge makes that a little more of a challenge. But I do think it's definitely easier to do it now than it was to do before the election, where it was on the cusp of being done for about 2 months and never did get done.
Thanks, Catherine. Appreciate it. All right, we're going to go to our Capitol Hill panel and continue to deal with these sort of policy questions as they come in. But I do want to introduce Jim Davis. Welcome back, Catherine Lehman again. And then Todd Wooten and Dimitri Karakitsos. Jim is a former member from the Tampa area in Florida, ran for governor in the mid-2000s in Florida, and has been with Holland and Knight since then. Obviously focuses a lot of his time and effort on energy and commerce issues, and is one of the co-founders of the New Democrats in the House. Todd joins us most recently from another lobbying firm. Before that, was a counsel on the Senate Finance Committee for Chairman Wyden, and also dealt with legislative director responsibilities for Senator Stabenow, and originally came to Washington working for Blanche Lincoln. So welcome, Todd. And then Dimitri Karakitsos, who I didn't introduce yet, but has been talking a bunch, worked on the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee for 8 years, is the principal author in the Senate for the Frank Lautenberg Toxics Reform Act, which we were lucky enough to work together on for the chemical sector about 5 or 6 years ago, and has been with Holland and Knight for about 4 years, and is our senior Senate Republican lobbyist. So let me hand it off to you guys and get your thoughts on the House and the Senate moving forward, taking up the Biden agenda. What is the art of the doable, which is a question we have gotten about 35 times here on the chat. And what do you see getting done, and how do you see the parties working with each other?
Okay, Rich, I'll start. Talk a little bit about the fundamentals in the House. I think there's little doubt that Speaker Pelosi will retain the speakership. Steny Hoyer will continue to be the majority leader. They'll work very effectively as a team. Look for a stepped up role from Representative Hakeem Jeffries as the chair of the caucus. Among the major committees, the one contest I see of interest will be Rosa DeLauro running to be the appropriations chair, along with Marcy Kaptur against Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who will be the younger of those three vying for that. That will be a hearty race. As far as the relationship between the Speaker and the New Dems and the Blue Dogs, with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, Congressional Black Caucus, and the Progressive Caucus, this situation, the Speaker's been in it before. and many of these groups have been in before as well. They know how to work together. Won't always be pretty, won't always be private, but this is a dynamic they're very accustomed to dealing with, and I'm confident they'll be able to work together, even though, as Catherine Lehman mentioned, it will be a smaller margin between the Democrats and Republicans. In terms of the agenda, I believe Senator McConnell has expressed an interest in essentially continuing the negotiations that started before the election, and Speaker Pelosi has been actually very consistent in the goals that she's established for the House and has expressed some willingness to negotiate the numbers. As has been mentioned earlier, this is a perfect opportunity if in fact Joe Biden is the next president, for him to be supporting in an appropriate fashion, since he will not be the president, a coming together and compromise, which of course is how he campaigned and who he is. How the president, who we can all agree is unpredictable, will play a part in that is certainly relevant. The pay for with that bill is the key point. This Congress has demonstrated its willingness to essentially treat this as emergency spending and to continue to spend. Obviously, their appetite for that is diminishing. However, the statistics with the COVID and the economy are not encouraging and will probably worsen as furloughs become permanent layoffs and as the numbers continue to rise throughout the country in terms of hospitalization. When you get into next year, I'm still coming off the Biden campaign, so I'm getting up to speed on the transition, but the transition has been working for months on an agenda. And the bill to stimulate the economy, to invest in infrastructure, perhaps along the lines of the shovel-ready approach that President Obama and President Biden used, and President Biden helped spearhead to get the votes in the Senate, could be a similar model, and the major issue may simply be the size of that. The big bone of contention with a Senate dominated by Republicans, if in fact that is the case, will be the pay for. Ron mentioned earlier the carried interest issue. This will be a true test of Senator Biden, then President Biden's ability to navigate in the Senate using his very strong personal relationships, his insight into these offices, into who's up for re-election in 2022, to try to find some middle ground. Two other issues I'll briefly mention. Beth referred to climate change. I think that will be a priority in a Biden administration. I think that will be one of the issues where they push hard, and that will clearly encounter some partisan resistance I think they're prepared to deal with. If you look at the Select Committee on Climate Change, you see a blueprint for Democrats of varying ideologies to come together and work on that. There is certainly an industry coalition developing behind doing something fundamental in climate, whether it's the insurance industry, segments of the conventional energy industry, the defense community, and parts of the country that have acknowledged that something needs to be done with respect to climate. Last issue I'll mention is healthcare. I think that will principally be a regulatory and administrative agenda. There certainly is a lot of work to be done to both revisit and undo some of the things that a Trump administration has done, and has been alluded to by Beth as well. I think there is a remarkable level of demoralization inside a lot of these agencies. And I think there's going to be a lot of work to be done to sort of re-personnel these offices. I do think you're going to see some prominent Republicans in this cabinet, but in terms of getting the wheels of government turning again, whether it's to deal with COVID or stimulants, there's going to be a lot of work to be done behind the scenes by a Biden administration working with Congress.
Todd, how are you viewing the Senate here?
Rich, I think probably what I'll do is just start with kind of the basic nuts and bolts. When you look at the heads of the various committees for the Democrats, at least on its face, that shouldn't change. You didn't have anybody lose, you don't have anybody retiring. And so as it sits today, you would have the same ranking members for all those committees that you had for this last Congress. I think that the kind of interesting thing with Senate Dems, and obviously there's disappointment. I think a lot of folks were really expecting that they would have control of the body, and they were already starting to think about the different things they wanted to do and issues that they wanted to raise. And they have to take a step back from that, at least for the moment. But I think the next thing that really could determine things with the leadership of committees is, if the Biden administration, the prospective Biden administration, if they tap various senators to possibly go into to possibly go in as the heads of various departments. I'm going to use one as an example just to kind of show how it could fall. If you look at HHS, I don't know if it's likely that Senator Murray would be someone who would be named to that, but she's certainly someone who's talked about. If that happened, that opens up the number 3 slot in Senate leadership. It also opens up the top Dem slot on the Help Committee. That would fall to Senator Sanders, which obviously he has coveted for quite some time. It would also mean that probably on the Budget Committee, which Senator Sanders currently heads, that would fall to Senator Merkley. I think that these things are important in the larger context of there's still a considerable amount of angst with the race in Kentucky. I think that a lot of folks on the more progressive wing of the party were not happy with Amy McGrath in that race. And I think they feel somewhat vindicated. So I think that those voices are still going to be pretty loud within the caucus, and they're going to have to find ways to try to mollify them. One way to do that is with slots in leadership. So I think that it will be instructive to look at kind of how that shakes out and what they're doing. Taking a step back, it was mentioned earlier that I started my career working for my then home state senator, if you can believe it, a Democrat from Arkansas, Blanche Lincoln, who was a lovely lady. I was really lucky to start my career in the Senate working with her, but at the time I found it incredibly frustrating because we would wait to take a position on nearly everything until the very last minute. And as a staffer, I had people calling me all the time and saying, "What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing?" I realized, now and definitely later when I was with her, what she was doing. And I think that when you look at Joe Manchin, when you look at Kirsten Sinema, when you look at your John Testers, those are people who are going to have some power here. Those are people who are going to probably put themselves in play on anything major to try and, see what they can get. It's as much their Senate as it is the Senate of perhaps the progressives or whoever else who kind of wants to put it forward. Last thing I would say is I think if it is a Biden administration, I think you could see a significant number of senior staff leave on the Dem side. A number of senior staff were very burned out in 2019. They stayed through 2020, believing that they would either be in the majority or they would have this possibility to perhaps go to the executive branch. They're not going to be in the majority. And it really wears on you. And I think that you could see, I think you could see some pretty significant departures from some senior level positions, both at the committees and also in Senate Dem leadership.
Thanks, Todd. Dimitri, you want to pick up from there on the Republican side? Obviously, your leadership is going to stay pretty much the same there, but you have a list of rotating names on committee.
Yeah, well, just to start with adding to some of the discussion, I think almost more notably than what we can expect to try to accomplish in the next couple of years, if Republicans keep the Senate, it's what might be off the table, right? There's been talks of major tax increases, sweeping climate policy, DC statehood, ending the filibuster, court packing, and that largely, I think even if we're at 50-50 split with a Biden presidency, I think it disappears. As you mentioned, no significant change in leadership. Republicans will swap out the NRSC chair every 2 years. There's been Todd Young from Indiana, and it's expected to be Rick Scott from Florida for the next election cycle. But on the committee level, we'll have a slew of changes. Just to run through a couple. Senator Bozeman will take over the Ag Committee from retiring Senator Roberts. Senator Murkowski is term limited from chairing the Energy Committee, and Senator Brasso is seen as her likely successor there. That opens up Senator Brasso's spot atop the Environment and Public Works Committee, which I think Senator Capito is expected to take. Senator Crapo takes over the Finance Committee from Grassley. That I think in turn leaves Senator Portman to take over Senate Banking, and Senator Grassley to return to Judiciary Committee, which moves Senator Graham over to the Budget Committee. I think Rubio is likely the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, where he's been serving as active chairman. We'll also see a new chairman in Homeland Security and Small Business Committee. I've seen a couple questions pop up specifically about the Health Committee. I believe Senator Burr is next in line seniority wise. The question is whether he's in a place to take the gavel right now. He did give up his chairmanship of the Intel Committee because of the ongoing investigation. And so if Senator Burr is not the next chairman, Rand Paul is actually next in line to take that committee over. We talked a little bit about, I think, how a Republican Senate deals with President Trump. But obviously, if we have a Biden administration, all eyes will really be on the relationship between Leader McConnell and President Biden. With the Senate approval needed to confirm judges and senior administration officials, it's likely going to moderate some of the Biden administration's nominees. More extreme nominees will certainly face a difficult road to confirmation, which then in turn could slow the work of some of the administration's priorities on the regulatory and executive side. As they try to kind of roll back and change things from the Trump years. I think the last thing I would mention, I know nobody probably wants to hear about another election, but an interesting dynamic is going to be the 2022 elections. I think it's important to note that it's another difficult cycle for Senate Republicans who will be defending 22 of the 34 seats up. I think what you're going to see there is Republicans will have to walk a fine line between being perceived as principled and standing up to policies and nominees that they oppose for good reason, or viewed as obstructionist and overly partisan. My opinion is Leader McConnell is pretty adept at navigating these difficult dynamics and kind of picking his battles pretty wisely. But he's definitely going to have his hands full in a divided government, with a new administration potentially. And just to quickly name a few of the Republican seats that'll be defending: Alaska, Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. So a lot of the battlegrounds we're in now. You can also anticipate pretty highly contested races in Arizona and Georgia, where the special election winners will be up again. And then, with not a whole lot of pickup options like we had with Alabama and potentially Michigan in this race, but I think there'll probably be some focus on, Colorado, Nevada, and New Hampshire from the Republican side.
Thanks, Dimitri. I have to say, neither of you kind of mentioned the possibility, but I wouldn't be fulfilling my stand-up political comedy role if I didn't mention at least the prospect of enjoying watching Help Committee hearings chaired by Rand Paul with Bernie Sanders as the ranking member. If Senator Burr did pass on it and Bernie finally got his opportunity, I can't imagine that we wouldn't start every hearing with the theme of The Odd Couple kind of playing underneath it. But if that doesn't come to pass, we'll have to find our entertainment elsewhere. Let me transition now, but just referencing Dimitri's point to Catherine on the House Republican agenda and where things go. Dimitri referenced there are a whole bunch of seats that are up next time for Senate Republicans that are vulnerable, including probably front and center Senator Toomey from Pennsylvania, who will be retiring, has decided not to run again. And that's just going to be a difficult seat, obviously, for Republicans to hold. So you could be in a situation where Democrats, even if that doesn't happen this time, have a pickup opportunity next time. But as Catherine is about to tell us, the president's party in an off-year election, particularly the first off-year election, tends to take it in the shorts in the House. And with Republicans making the gains they have made this year in 2020, they probably set themselves up quite nicely. Isn't that what you were going to say, Catherine?
It is. Of course, again, we defied that historical trend in 1998 because I think we were banking on it. Certainly, I was there. Certainly the case that things will be closer. I still personally think that Speaker Pelosi, and if it is President Biden, will kind of be driving the train in terms of figuring out what needs to be done. Again, the question is, how does she maneuver with a much smaller majority? I doubt the progressives are going to be any more reasonable. As I said yesterday, the the Freedom Caucus for the Republicans is sort of the progressives for the Democrats, and they want what they want and they want it now, and don't understand that to the extent that she's not getting to 218 and she wants to get something done, she needs to get try to work with the Republicans to get things done. So, you know, working across party lines is something we haven't been good at for quite some time in Washington. Quite honestly, it's not really what the voters want their elected representatives to do. So it will be very interesting to see how all of that works out. I suspect Republicans will start House Republicans will be putting forth policies, much like they did this time, of what they would do if they were in charge. I don't think those, I think those are easily overtaken by events and other things that are going on. And I would expect Republicans in the House to pick up some seats in 2022. I can't believe we're talking about 2022 already. I will note that this election early on, like for the first 7 months, 8 months, 9 months of the year, the NRCC was putting out a lot of paper about how many Republicans are in Trump, how many Democrats are in Trump districts, and how we're going to take all those back. And at some point, it's like, yeah, that's not happening. So there's a little more. We will learn the lessons of this election and then try and figure out how to go forward from there. But I think from a policy perspective, you know, a lot of it depends on who's the president and who's in charge of the Senate. And I will say that House Republicans, even though they're in the minority, had the ability to get things done because they could call the White House or call an agency and say, hey, you need to do X, and bring it to their attention. And with the Biden presidency, that very powerful, as from a lobbying perspective, that very, very powerful tool of having a member weigh in with the administration, even though you're in the minority, is going to be gone if Biden wins.
Good stuff. Thanks, Catherine. So we have questions piling up here. Before we move on to our last section, I want to go through a bunch of these. First one's a real good one, although not necessarily congressionally oriented, but could be anybody other than the current president, but could also be the current president. Assuming President Trump does not prevail here, who will we see rise to leadership in the Republican Party to help rebuild a Trump-less Republican Party? And how might the Republican Party change, if at all? I know that's a big question. And I know I'm the Democrat, so just for the heck of it, I am going to make sure people are aware. One of the first things I saw on Instagram this morning was Trump 2024. So I wouldn't presume, if Trump does not prevail here, that there's going to be some handoff of the baton. But let me ask my Republican colleagues, Catherine and Krista Lacey, Dimitri, what your thoughts are in that space.
Do I have to? I don't think
we're just having fun here.
I don't think the Trumps, plural, are going away. I think there's a lot of voters out there, obviously, as you can see in the presidential, where even these battleground states are very close. They like President Trump's leadership. They like him pushing back against the elites, and he can indeed run again. He'll be pretty old when he does that. So I've had friends who said to me, "Oh, he'll go down to Mar-a-Lago and become the kingmaker." You know, his son has talked about running. I think it's remains to be seen how we. I just think Trump's will continue to play a role in the Republican Party.
Dimitri, Chris, who else you guys got?
Yeah, I think that's right. They may continue to play a role, but you know, much like we saw 4 years ago with the crowded primary, you're likely to see a lot of different folks emerge. You know, you're going to have governors' names thrown around, like Governor Noem from South Dakota. You're going to have folks like former Governor Nikki Haley floating around out there. You're going to have probably a number of senators. some, trying to kind of pick up pieces of the Trump mantle, and some, a little bit more distance from him. Folks throw out names like Tom Cotton, Senator Sass. So I think it's probably going to be a 4-year long audition process should the president lose, with a lot of people vying for that.
Good question. Good answer. Chris, anything?
Yeah, I agree with Dimitri. I think that the other name I would add, I don't know if you said Josh Hawley, but I think he's going to be in the mix. So I think it's going to be become known fairly quickly, who's vying for this. And I don't know if anybody mentioned the family. Maybe you did, Rich, but obviously that they're in the mix as well. But at this point, if I had to bet, I would bet that Trump runs again in 4 years. We'll see how the next couple of months go, but I would bet on Trump trying to run again for president.
Let me go to a nuts and bolts question. Assuming Dems are going to continue in the House majority with Eliot Engel leaving the Congress, Ron and Jim, what's your call on who the next chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee will be?
Well, there's a couple choices. I'm not sure yet. I mean, again, there's people like Ted Deutsch, who has sort of been rising up and has a lot of respect inside the caucus. There's more senior members, so not sure yet. I think that one remains to be seen.
Let's see, just going up in my question queue here. Just similar question on the transition, Shauna, for Senator Harris to Vice President Harris. How do you see the process playing out, and who are the likely folks who will be on tab to replace her in the governor's appointment?
Oh, that's a good question. I've had a few folks reach out to me about that. I really don't know. I initially thought Mayor Garcetti would be coming in for the administration, but I don't know if he's going to be doing that now. I think they have some good picks, but, I'm not sure who the governor is going to choose in that regard. It'll be interesting to see.
Catherine, Burgess or CMR at the top of energy and commerce?
That is the question, isn't it? I'm on one of their steering committees, so I'm not going to say which one. I think perhaps that so many women being elected takes some of the pressure off making a woman ranking member. But I think they both probably have a good shot at it. We'll just either work in the steering committee hard, work in the members hard, and McMorris Rodgers will probably be the new steering rep, taking the place of Greg Walden, who was on the steering committee. Obviously, she won't be there to decide when they're making a decision on energy and commerce, but that is the big one for House Republicans to figure out who's going to be. Is that another Molinaro question?
It was not. He was
What's
smart enough to put it under anonymous attendee this time.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Yeah, it's less clear who that's going to be. I don't think, sometimes ahead of time that, it's going to be one or the other, but I think this time it's just not as clear what's going to happen. They're both raising money. Burgess is raising a lot of money, was never in leadership, so has done a very good job raising money. McMorris Rodgers has done a good job raising money. So I don't think it's really clear who's gonna win that one. Like other ones, I could tell you, oh, so and so just doesn't have a chance. But this one, it's less clear who's gonna win.
Rich, this is Ryan. I want to go back to the foreign affairs question for a second. The other two people that are definitely in the mix are Greg Meeks and Brad Sherman. I think if anybody probably has the upper hand at this point, it's probably Greg Meeks, a little more senior, He's been working a little bit, so I think that would probably be my number one suggestion about who gets that.
You know, somebody by the name of Maria Gold just told me that I'm talking too loud, so I will try and talk more quietly. Let me just mention that we had a lot of questions on the lame duck session, so let me at least go through my view and let you guys shoot at it for a minute, and then we'll do one more question and go to our last section because people have been hanging on here a long time. You know, I think if we presume, at least during the lame duck session, given the runoff, that we're going to have, you know, a likely Republican majority in 2021, and that's what a President-elect Biden would need to presume. If I am President-elect Biden in that scenario, assuming he is declared the winner of the race, I want Mitch McConnell to do as much as possible on President Trump's tab for the last 2 months of the year here. And that means you're going to try and get the appropriations bills done. You're going to try and get a COVID-4 bill done. We have numerous authorizations pending, from the Water Resources Development Act to an energy bill. We have some tax extenders that ideally need to get done. So I think it's to Biden's advantage to have all that on President Trump's check. And I'm sure that Leader McConnell is going to pitch this to President Trump as this is a great sort of legacy thing for you to be able to get COVID-4 done and, you know, kind of address those issues in your final months in office. So I think we probably have more of a lame duck than would have been the case if we had a certain incoming Democratic Senate. But let me throw that out there and see if anybody on the panel wants to say pshaw.
I think the flip side of that is that President Trump doesn't want to do anything. He just buries it and says, I'm done. I'm still fighting the election story, and I'm not happy. And, you know, I fought for my people, and just doesn't want to cooperate.
I would add that I think the Biden team is prepared for either scenario. And one of the advantages, if it does get an infrastructure stimulus bill gets combined with the next COVID bill, is it takes some of the pressure off the pay for, because there's already a consensus to basically treat the COVID spending like emergency funding. And that clearly melds into funding for stimulus in the economy and makes the pay for issue a little less challenging for President Biden in the Senate.
Well, and I would just kind of pick up on that. I mean, from my friends in Democratic leadership, I don't want to speak for Republicans, but I think that they took the Republican senators' concerns about cost very seriously, and they felt like they were very sincere in that. The issue, of course, is that issue, if Republicans do hold the Senate, doesn't go away next Congress either. So you can kind of do it now, or you can do it then. One way or the other, you have to figure out your way. You have to figure out your way through it. I think what you said is intensely logical, Rich. But again, I don't necessarily know if you can work through that in this time frame.
Yeah, and I think outside of just COVID, though, you know, there was a view that Democrats certainly believe that they were going to have a sweeping new majority in the Senate. Why compromise in a lame duck and do some of these things like an energy bill or other things when you could write it single party in the next Congress? With that looking less likely, or at least a tighter majority that won't allow for, wholesale kind of rewrites of some of these things. I mean, it opens up the lame duck for other things as well, an energy package, a WRDA bill. Obviously we have to finish the defense authorization bill. So I think, it gives us an opportunity at a more robust lame duck than had the election come out in different ways.
All right, thanks everybody. The last question I just wanted to deal with, and I'm going to take a first stab at it. Probably the issue of 2021 is likely to be healthcare at the end of the day, and not just because of the virus. Obviously, as people know, we have 20 million people insured through the Affordable Care Act right now. We have another 12 million who lost their insurance, and so one thing President-elect Biden or President Biden could do quickly is open up the Affordable Care Act to allow those people to get insurance through the act. but everybody is probably also aware there's a pending case that I believe was heard yesterday before the Supreme Court on the Affordable Care Act. And there's a chance that part or all of the act could be struck down early in the spring. That obviously would potentially immediately take away insurance from everybody who has insurance through the act. If only a part of it is struck down, obviously, perhaps insurance is maintained for those people, but the act has been weakened so much that all of a sudden healthcare becomes front and center, sort of a critical policy issue, particularly given the number of people who have long-term impacts from surviving and battling through the virus. So, we've talked about the ability to do bipartisan work in Congress. How do folks feel, House and Senate, should there be need to legislate on healthcare to actually get something done? And could a President Biden, drag something across the finish line that would help provide coverage for people attendant to the Affordable Care Act?
I think this is one of these issues, Rich, where President Biden would be very aggressive. He campaigned on it. He thinks it's the right thing to do. The issue is the pre-existing condition. Others may be able to articulate what the Republican plan is that's plausible. I know there's a message, but I think the House would move in an instant. I do think the legal argument is a thin legal argument in the Supreme Court, and I think the conventional wisdom is it's not going to be overturned. But if it is, I think that President Biden would push very hard, and this might be an issue he'd be prepared to lose as opposed to compromise, just to make it clear where he stood, and leave a Republican Senate to explain what their alternative was. Hope we don't get in that situation.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I think the president or vice president will be pushing, trying to solidify the Obamacare Act. And if something were to happen to it, I think the Republicans would have to try to figure out how to work with them on this, because it's an issue. I don't think they would want to go into the next election cycle having so many people lose their health care, particularly during a pandemic or coming off the end of a pandemic. I just think it's a losing proposition. So if it's an issue where they have to figure out how to work together on it, I think they will.
One of the complications of the passage of the original act was it's so complicated and hard to explain. And so it's easy to pick at and criticize. And now that it's settled in a little bit and people understand at least some of the basics of pre-existing, and 26-year-olds get on their parents' plan, and anti-discrimination against sex, male, female on issues of coverage. I think it's probably easier this time to, once you've had it and you're taking it away, Americans don't like things taken away. It becomes sort of something they're used to. So although there's going to be pushback, and I think it would be something probably could get passed. It would be much better if Republicans work with them, but it certainly would be something that I think you would invite Republicans to the conversation. If you don't like what I'm offering, come up with something else, and it would be framed that way to the American people. But again, 30 million people is a lot of people that would automatically lose care, and I think that would be a big story.
Yeah, I would just add, I think pre-existing conditions are something that Republicans have been, and were forced to, in some respects, been very vocal about supporting, for better or worse. DC doesn't always work, super well proactively, but typically in crisis time and when backs are against the wall, folks feel the need to come together. And I agree, with Sean on basically, but I don't know how many of these Republican senators, for example, are going to want to go into a re-election with nothing out there. So I think there's been an effort. Senator Graham, tried to articulate some policies. And I think we'll probably see a continuation of that.
I'd like to add a note, if I could, on the political twist here. There's a story in the U.S. Senate where the senator's walking down the street and this little lady says to him, "Senator, I dearly love my Medicare. Don't you ever let the federal government get involved in it and screw it up." And the reason I mention that is the two pickups in South Florida by the Republicans were in two congressional districts with some of the highest eligibility and participation of Obamacare in the entire United States. So when you polled, if you asked people do they like their health care plan, the Affordable Care Act, a lot of folks did. If you asked them if they liked Obamacare, they didn't. So unfortunately, there is still a political quagmire on this particular issue.
All right, I am going to push us along because we obviously could talk forever, and we are known for doing that, to our last section where Alex, with me playing Phil Rizzuto, will cover lobbying strategies and best practices. So Alex, take it away, baby.
Fantastic. Well, what a fascinating and enlightening session. Again, a big appreciation to the Holland and Knight team for all of their insight in these very key times. What we wanted to end on today is just some best practices for you all. You might be sitting here weighing the implications of what you've just heard, of all these statistics of the election results. And our goal here is to give you just some ideas to think about that you might be able to implement as you work towards getting ready for 2021. So we've got three big ones, but the first one is just focused on identifying new legislative champions and threats. So as we talked about, we've got 55 new members of Congress coming in and a consistent number of existing members of Congress who are going to be approaching new issues as we look at possibly a new administration and obviously new policy priorities that will be introduced. Really three different levels of sophistication for you to think about here. The first one is diving in and simply focusing on the biographical data of members of Congress. So one of our favorite things to do is to go through and search through all the biographies that you know of and background on members of Congress to find people who might be champions for your issues. Great example here is former Representative and future Senator Cynthia Loomis from Wyoming, happens to have a bachelor's degree in animal science and biology. So as you think about approaching her around energy, environment issues, realizing that provides an opportunity to have more of a personalized conversation and immediately work and form a relationship there. And so what I encourage you as you begin to do your stakeholder mapping for 2021 to really do that deep dive on, okay, where is the background that these individuals are coming from? As we mentioned, 65% of the newly elected members of Congress are coming from previous political experience. And as you all well know, obviously the committees that they serve on give a good indication of the issues they care about, but as well would encourage you all to look at the caucus data. For example, Rep-elect Pete Sessions from Texas had previously served on the Congressional Cement Caucus, an interesting caucus, if there is one for everything, and worth a little more follow-up on, okay, what led him to do that? What are the specific industries that he's relevant? And obviously a further best practice that if you're able to be able to create a caucus, it's a great way to start to be able to get members to signal their support and an easy ask that you can give them to be involved. And the intermediate level is to do a really deep dive through all their social media posts. We've seen a huge increase in members of Congress and state legislators and elected officials using social media in this pandemic to be able to really focus on communicating to their constituents. And oftentimes they're talking about key issues. You would be surprised about everything that a member of Congress or an elected official might say on social media. But there's incredible examples on how they're talking about your organization, talking about your company, and talking about the specific issues that you're working on, where you might find totally new members and totally new champions that you might not have thought about. And then on the advanced side, would also encourage you to dive and look into news monitoring. Some of our most advanced clients that we've seen are going to look at what are the issues being covered in a member of Congress's district, and how can they use that to come and give the member of Congress examples of why they should support a specific proposal. So a great example of this obviously is the impacts of COVID. We had a client, the American Hotel and Lodging Association, who's talked about this publicly, go in and take the news articles of how members of Congress constituents, hotels in the district were being impacted, put that together in a briefing deck, and then be able to share that with them. And that can provide lots of new opportunities where even if a member of Congress doesn't specifically care about your issue off the top, gives then a chance for them to say, hey, your constituents care about the issue and are being impacted, and you should be thinking about it. Final bonus one in this section is stakeholder surveys. So I would highly encourage you to run a relationship survey of your team, of your advocates, of your board members, supporters, employees. With all of these new members and with all of this focus on the election, there's a likelihood that someone in your universe likely knows a good number of either staffers or elected officials, because maybe their kids play t-ball together. Maybe they go to the same church. Maybe they went to the same high school. But those relationships can be invaluable to you as you start to map out where might there be pathways to influence and where are there opportunities that if you have a chance to sit down to one of these new legislators, they can give you some immediate credibility, realizing that we're going to be operating in a socially distanced world where being able to introduce ourselves in person is going to be significantly harder. So that's the first group of best practices as it comes to stakeholder scoring. Rich, anything you want to add there from the Holland and Knight perspective?
No, I would just say, I mean, obviously, I kind of think of that group as sort of the eat your spinach category. You know, we have gotten into a space in terms of advocacy that simply having relationships and establishing personal relationships is not enough at this juncture. It's really important to know who these people are, where they came from, because you're not going to be able to use the coin of the realm, which is your ability to talk to somebody and in the first 7 seconds figure out how to influence them if you don't know their background and you don't know you know, why they think they got elected and what is driving them from a district-based view. And I think the best advocates out there today, whether they be at a firm, a trade association, or a company, do the work and do the detail in order to be able to do that.
Spot on. I love the eat your spinach metaphor, even if I personally am not a big fan of spinach. Second big concept that we want to leave you with is starting to think about proactively around communications and specifically planning out your policy communication calendar for 2021. Big reason for this is that in a socially distanced world, again, you're not going to be able to spend as much time on Capitol Hill as you might have with previous new Congresses. And so thinking about proactively, how are you going to be in front of members and their staff? So beginner, 3 different levels on this. Again, beginner level here is just starting by planning out of sending a monthly themed email out to members of Congress's staff on your specific subject, highlighting something positive that's happened to your organization. Maybe in January, it's just simply introducing your organization. What are the issues that you care about? In February, maybe it's a deep dive on who your members are, who are your employees, who are the key people that you're representing, and then following it up with specifics on issues so that these members and their staff start to learn a little bit more on who are you and who are you representing and what is it that you care about. And what you'll find is that consistent messaging will then both put your name in front of these individuals, but also as well give them a touch point where then there's the ability to reach out and say, hey, I really appreciated that post, or I really appreciated your insight on this issue. Can we sit down and have a meeting? And so we're seeing organizations now sit down and make out that plan for 2021. Obviously, it can be in drafts. So as things change, as we get a sense of what a transition team's agenda is or a current administration's continuing agenda is, you can update that. But ensuring that you've got a strong plan in place to communicate and share your message out is really the basic level 101. Second big item, it would be segmenting. So we're seeing some really advanced things happen of email communication segmented by issue and by role. So what are going to be your relationships and outreach to Senate chiefs of staff? And does that differ from House chiefs of staff? Are you going to talk about and work on building relationships with people that focus on energy and the environment, separate than people that might focus on tax and appropriations? And then also thinking about segmenting by the strength of your relationship. Who are people that you've known for years and you have strong relationships with, and you just want to make sure that they stay updated on the work of your organization, versus who are the folks that are new staff who are coming in, people new to their role, taking over a new portfolio, where you need to focus on more of the introduction. And this gives where you can really start to segment out and dive a level deeper in on that communication that's happening. And then the third and the more advanced piece of this is to start adding events, and yes, even virtual ones, as we're not advocating to come back in person just yet to your calendar. We've seen clients have a tremendous amount of success doing virtual briefings and events, a little bit like this one, but just focused on Hill staff and members of Congress. It's nearly free, especially when you're using Zoom and webinar technology. You don't have any geographic limitations, and you've got a lot of stakeholders that are looking for more information and more insight. They want to learn. They're new sometimes to the Hill, they might be new to the issue, or they just want the latest and greatest on perspective, very similar to the reason why many of you have joined us today to hear what's happening with the election. So we would encourage you to make sure and thoughtful that you are sending out those invites and providing people the opportunity to come in and join. And then the final one is on this is bringing social media into it. So we're seeing a tremendous amount of organizations really jump onto Twitter and embrace what we call policy Twitter accounts, a Twitter account that is solely focused on interacting with lawmakers so that they can retweet and highlight lawmakers that are doing good things, and also as well be able to send out their own content and share messages and information as it relates. So you see examples on this slide from IBM, from Toyota, from Fidelity. There's about 60 plus of these, and the Public Affairs Council has a really great website. But as you think about 2021 in this digital environment, we really encourage you to think a little bit bigger about how you're going to communicate and innovate in new ways. Rich, anything you want to add on the communications front?
Yeah, and I want to focus on sort of the COVID environment, because I think we are all getting a little long in the tooth in terms of Zoom meetings and calls, and longing for the ability to kind of get back into a congressional office and talk to somebody in person again. But that's not going to happen anytime soon. And now we're going to be in this situation where you have 50 some odd new members of Congress coming in who you have in many instances, no relationship with. And, you know, as we're finding out, it's one thing to try to continue a relationship with a staffer or a member, getting to know somebody brand new who you don't have a previous relationship over video is incredibly hard. And so, you know, in that space, I think it's really important to take whatever opportunities you can to break out of the Zoom environment and kind of a Zoom official business meeting to kind of get together. And, you know, even just to be honest, a Zoom fundraiser where the member can let his or her hair down a little bit and just talk informally, as opposed to have to be, you know, decider in chief on what position they're going to take, is a little bit more of a laid back environment. But I think we're all going to be needing to look for those opportunities to establish new connections with newly electeds coming into Washington for the first time here in a way that is really going to be a challenge. And hopefully, you know, some period of time, whether it's 3, 6, you know, 12 months from now, we're going to be, you know, back up there in the buildings doing what we all like to do. But in the meantime, we have a new class of people we need to get to know, and we need to be creative in how we do it.
Indeed. And I think the key element there, as Rich said, is it's really up to all of us to create those engagement opportunities, because they're not going to be necessarily hand delivered in the same way or created for us in the ways that they used to be. Last big one that we have for everyone is really thinking about grassroots organizing. And this is meant as a follow-up both to that conversation around you have new members you don't have a relationship with, but you also have existing members who can be harder to reach and to get access to. And so really beginning by thinking about what is your strategy over the course of the next 6 months in a new Congress, and also realizing we just saw the highest turnout in a presidential election since the 1900s. People care about politics. They want to participate. They obviously have their voices heard. And so how is there an opportunity to amplify that? First big one is you should be harnessing all of this engagement and focus to grow your advocate list. Thinking about who are your newsletter subscribers? Can you get more from Facebook, from Twitter, lead ads? Can you get people to sign up through texting to be able to do events, do paid partnerships? But you should be having people join up for your organization, making sure your employees are engaged, your trade association members are engaged. Because right now there's a lot of interest and focus, and you want to harness that while you can to get people to opt in and be a part of your efforts. The second thing is starting to then prepare those folks to be ready to advocate and really getting them engaged to create a culture of advocacy, so that instead of just a one-off, you have a group of people who will consistently come back and focus and help you. Some of the most innovative things we've seen here is gamification. So in the same way when we go to Starbucks and we get sparkles when we have our third latte, how is there an opportunity where the third time that when somebody comes back to take action, they get rewards and you have a program to recognize them so they feel like there's continued engagement. The other really innovative thing that we've seen is a series of quizzes. So take all your new advocates and say, okay, let's run through a quiz on who these new members are, on what are our key issues, and make sure that they are fully educated and ready to go so that they are ready to engage. And those provide opportunities to get your advocates educated, ready to go, so that when the new Congress comes in, you've got them in place to take action and start doing that outreach and engagement. And then, of course, this is the big one, launching campaigns on issues for your first 100 days. You should make sure that you are ready to go and that they are ready to take advantage of either all the policies that could happen that you want to go ahead and promote, or things that could happen that might be negative to you. And this is a chart here of the number of bills and resolutions passed in the first 100 days over the course of the last 5 presidents. And you see that there's a tremendous amount of legislative activity that happens. And you want to make sure that from day one of the new Congress, you are ready to go to be able to engage as those policy proposals are put forward and to help shape them so that hopefully you can have the external pressure from the grassroots front that can be matched obviously with the internal conversations with members and their staff. Rich, anything you have to add here from the grassroots side?
Yeah, for sure. And I'll just go a little bit broader. At Holland and Knight, sort of one of our core philosophies is that campaign style advocacy for public affairs efforts before Congress and the executive branch are critical. And that requires grassroots, grass tops, traditional and social media, with a particular focus on surrounding members and decision makers in the executive branch with the kind of feedback that they can't ignore. And when you look at the numbers from the election so far, we have a turnout rate of 66.9%. That has not happened in 120 years. So just a huge turnout. Over 160 million people voted over the period of this election. And with that kind of engagement, there's a lot of power there. And because the result was so close, there's perhaps even more power there than the numbers themselves would connote, in the sense that at this point, the gradations, not only at the congressional level in particular districts, as we're seeing the number of undecided seats still, but obviously in the Senate with close races, and at the presidential level, that no one can be taken for granted in these battleground states. So if you can cloak your issue in campaign style advocacy and have people weighing in at a grassroots, grass tops level through media in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, and make the case that this issue can move the needle, you are going to be much more likely to be successful than just using shoe leather lobbying. And so, we really view ourselves as campaign organizers when we run issue management campaigns. And everybody needs to be thinking that way going forward on your core issues.
I think what you've heard over the course of the day and from Rich is that we not only are going to be faced with a new Congress with a lot of additional complexity, but the strategies are changing, and that there are organizations obviously like Quorum and Holland and Knight who are really pushing to be at the cutting edge of that. But we're certainly not alone, and we have a lot of clients of both of our firms who are really doing that and thinking about it in a new way. And so obviously we've taken the opportunity today to really try and give you as much insight as we can, but our goal day to day is to be helpful. And so is there additional ways that either Quorum or Holland and Knight can help you as you focus your advocacy strategies and get ready for 2021? We're certainly excited and happy to do that. And I'll just end before turning over to Rich for a final word with a big thank you to each and every one of you for taking time to join us. We've done our best to put together what we hope is a very informative program. And I've certainly learned a lot from it, from hearing from the Holland and Knight team, and hopefully you have as well. So a big thank you from my end, and I'll turn it over to Rich for the final word.
Well, I'm tempted to end with the sign off of Click and Clack, the Tappet brothers from Car Talk, who always used to say, "You've wasted another perfectly good hour of your time listening to us." How many people could do, Car Talk and Admiral Stockdale is the real question. But we know and we understand that your time is the most valuable thing you have. We appreciate you giving it to us today. We hope you found this all helpful. The slides again for Quorum are downloadable off their site. You'll find our slides as a click through in the chat. I'll just remind everybody, but we are updating our slides at Holland and Knight probably twice a day. until it'll no longer be relevant, so that every time seats get called, the slides will evolve. And want to thank Alex and Quorum for their help today. We greatly respect what they do in the market. Look forward to continuing to work with them. And want to thank all our friends and clients who joined in today. And we look forward to continuing to work with all of you as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.